Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to memoQ Talks. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of memoQ Talks. Today, we are being joined by Mr. Peter Reynolds, who is the CEO of, or the co-CEO of memoQ, which makes him my boss. So what could go wrong? I'm interviewing my boss on a podcast. I better get these questions right. But we're going to be talking to Peter about strategy, what it is and why it's important, and how to get some. So Peter, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me here.
My pleasure. Before we jump into the topic at hand, would you mind giving like a little bit of background or explaining about your background in Loc and how and what is a co-CEO and why do we have one?
Okay. First, I'll just start with that because it's not that uncommon. There are quite a few companies around the place that have co-CEOs. Atlassian, who make Jira, have got one. HIG, that own Linebridge, have got one. Netflix have got co-CEOs. And in Peter Drucker's book, The Practice of Management, he points out that usually there's some sort of mechanism. The idea, he says the idea of one person that can answer all the questions and can do everything, the Superman CEO, is a myth. And usually there's some sort of group of people working together. It's just that in our case, we formalized it. Where I come from, I originally came from a social work background where I was working with people in homeless night shelters and homeless hostels. And I was working in the UK and I wanted to move back to Ireland. So I found a job in a company called Softrans, which at the time in the early 90s was the first ever localization translation company. It was called Softrans as in translating software, and they and various other people had created this concept that they called localization, which they had to then go to Silicon Valley and whatever and educate, and where you live too in Seattle, to educate people like the Microsoft people as to what they meant by this. But they became very successful. The company that I worked in the same office for 11 or so years, but the company changed its name from Softrans to Berlitz, the Bound Global Solutions, Linebridge, and my job in it changed. And by the time I left there, I was in charge of their development team, and many of the tools that we developed are still being used by Linebridge. After that, I went to a company. Linebridge at the time is based in Waltham, Massachusetts. So after I finished with Linebridge, I went to another company that was headquartered in Waltham, Massachusetts, called Idiom. And I was in Dublin. They were both within 1 mile from each other. And they were remarkably different. Idiom was a very young company. It had developed a tool called World Server and had a lot of innovative and visionary people in the company that helped push this whole idea of translation management systems. Around 2008, I left that and I got a phone call from a guy called Istvan Lengel, who at the time had, together with two other people, had created a company called Kilgrey. And they asked me to join them as a consultant. And my first job there was to persuade them that, just because they're, the way they put it was that we're nerds. We don't, why should anybody listen to us? We're Hungarian. Nobody listens to Hungarian people. So my first job was to turn that on its head and suggest that it's a really positive thing, having a company in Central Europe, that the standard of education is better, the access to developers are better. We had, for example, we're working with the local university, the local technical university, and there were 2 or 3 PhD graduates on developing the code. One of the software developers used to also write books on .NET, which were published by Rocks. So they were quite credible people that were working on our code. And my first job was to persuade my new colleagues by this time that being a small Hungarian company can have its advantages. One of my first roles within the company was around strategy, and what we did is we spent a lot of time analyzing what our competitors were doing. At this stage, nobody was paying us any attention. And what we discovered is that there were companies like SDL who had Trados and also had a TMS at the time, and they were aiming at either the enterprise or the translators. There was another company called Trill, which had a solution called Deja Vu, aimed at translators. Across and OnTram were both aimed very much at the enterprise. And what we discovered is that everybody was either aimed at the enterprises or the translators, and there was a loose brick there where the LSPs were. So what we decided to do is to aim ourselves at small to medium LSPs initially, and we could also figure out where we could meet them, because at around the same time, there were a couple of conferences, like ELIA had just started up in Europe. In America, there was ALC, and they gave us an opportunity to meet the people that we decided were our sweet spot for that moment. And we ended up growing at such a rate that for 3 years in a row, we won the Deloitte Fast 50 Awards in Europe.
So we are kind of jumping into strategy at this point. And so what you're saying is you were able to identify or come up with a strategy of, hey, let's go after this loose brick, right? So I want to hear the rest of the story, but we are going to come back later and just kind of get a broader understanding of what strategy is. But already, I mean, you were thinking very strategically, and I'm sure your exposure to working with all these different organizations who were trying to do similar things, but in a different way, kind of just opened up, your view in terms of, wow, these guys don't have a strategy. These guys have a completely different strategy. And that kind of helped have that I would assume that working for several different organizations kind of helped you have that, instead of just the blinders on, we're going to do it this way.
Yeah, exactly. Every time I worked for a different organization, I got educated. I also had done an MBA and got, an MBA is essentially a course that's constant case studies.
Right.
So you're constantly studying what other people have done and trying to learn from them and trying to figure out what they did right, what they did wrong, how you could do it better. And that's what we were doing when we were planning the early work with memoQ. My role in the company, I worked there for a year purely for shares, and became an owner in the company. And since then, I've been doing quite a lot of different things that within the company. We decided last year that myself and Balazs Kish would become the co-CEOs of the company. There was an issue. We had to solve a couple of problems, and memoQ was not growing as fast as we'd like, and we wanted to set that straight. So we worked out a plan for how to improve the way the company was growing and to make it a much more ambitious and a much more dynamic company, and hopefully a better place for people to work within the company. And where I am now, where I've been for the last year, is being co-CEO of the company. I'm enjoying that job. I'm surprised how much I'm enjoying it. Like everybody else, I imagine that CEOs have a very stressful job, but I'm finding it quite not exactly like that. Much more an enjoyable job to have. And I think it's going well. I like the people I work with are great. It's an exciting team. We've got exciting customers. They're pleasantly opinionated. Like, one of the great things with memoQ has always been that our customers will have strong opinions, and they're quite happy to tell you whenever you're going wrong. And that's very useful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so let's jump into the topic of strategy, because I know, and we'll talk a little bit about memoQ's strategy later, that there is a very clearly defined strategy for the company. But in general, what is your definition of strategy, and why is it important?
Well, if you're going somewhere, you need some plan to where you want to go, how you want to get there. And to me, this is very obvious. The problem is that when you're doing it as a company, it's not like you're getting in your car and you're going to, you're heading off to Seattle or somewhere, and you've got your GPS and everything's set up. No, it's more like you're planned to get somewhere, but nobody's built the road. And they definitely don't have a GPS. The nearest you've got in terms of tools that can tell you whether you're going straight is a compass. So your ability to do this, you have to very much keep everything in mind. One of the problems that we see a lot within our industry is that you can often get a lot of very creative and very clever people in the room. They can do a lot of brainstorming, and because they don't check, with their potential customers whether their ideas are right, they end up thinking that this should be a big success, and are surprised that it's not. And this seems to happen a lot, and people seem to be continuously surprised that they're not getting the results that they thought they would get. And the reason for this is they never validate their ideas. Their ideas can be brilliant, but unless somebody's going to unless you're going to find a customer for it, it doesn't count.
So one of the strategies, or part of your ideal strategy, is to make sure what you're selling actually there's a market for it. You just don't create it and hope that it's going to stick. You're going to go and validate it continually with your customers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There have been an awful lot of business books published over the last however many years, but I think the greatest sentence that was ever written in any of these is that the purpose of a business is to create a customer, and because of that, the two jobs of a business are innovation and marketing. And that was something that Peter Drucker wrote in 1954.
Wow.
And it is so clever, the idea that the purpose of the business is all about creating a customer. And he was also quite clear that he meant a customer was somebody that pays you money for your services or your whatever you produce. And this is something that occasionally, through booms and whatever, people lose track of this, and they believe that they can create a business without customers, and there'll be momentum, and it doesn't work. It also doesn't work if your entire focus is on shareholders and shareholder values. Unless you're focused on customers, it doesn't count. Like some years ago, people started. A lot of people were talking about the Simon Sinek video on TED, Getting to Why, and people saw this as a very powerful video, which it was, and a lot of good ideas in it. But if you go and look at the people that he was talking about in his video, like the life of the likes of Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos and whatever, when you look at what they're talking about, they're not talking about why, they're talking about who. Like Steve, Steve Jobs famously coined the phrase "start with the customer and work back." Jeff Bezos, every time he talks about customer obsession. Seneca is right partially about that why is important, but when you get, it's not enough. You have to start with the person, with the customer.
So let me ask you, and I, by the way, have my Steve Jobs black turtleneck on right now, so I'm glad you referenced him. So, yeah,
It looks great.
yeah, thank you. I probably don't carry it as well as Steve, but yeah, trying here. Um, you've throughout, your experience with various organizations, you've seen a variety of strategies. Plus, I know that you read a lot. You study, like you said, case studies. You have an MBA. Can you give an example of a strategy that you thought was very successful and very brilliant, and then maybe a strategy that was not so successful and you thought
Yeah.
was maybe poor? Obviously, no strategy at all. It might work, but that's probably the worst. It's just not having a strategy. But give an example of something that you thought was
I,
really effective.
I really like photography, and
Mhm.
like for example, the musician Lenny Kravitz. I could not tell you a single song he wrote, but I can identify photographs that he's taken, and I can tell you what sort of cameras he uses. And the cameras that he uses are Leica cameras, and one of the most amazing things that a company ever did was in the 1930s in Germany, when Hitler had just come to power. Uh, the, the son of the founder of the company, Ernst Leitz, whom was considered one of the greatest engineers of his generation, he immediately was working with other people to try to essentially make sure that all his employees who were Jewish would be transferred to their New York office. After they transferred all their employees, they started transferring other people in the neighborhood and the city that they were from were hired and were transferred to their New York office of Leica. There they'd be sacked and they would be given a camera, which was quite a valuable piece of equipment. But also they had a situation that at this stage, I think the other companies that dealt with photography in New York got to hear about this. So you'd have somebody, a Jewish family from that would be hired by the Leica family, immediately put on a boat to New York, and then sacked by Leica, hired by Kodak. And this went on from 1932 until the German borders were closed in 38 or something. And the amazing thing about it is that nobody heard about this until many, many years later. And the reason for that is that Ernst Leitz and the family felt that they were just doing what, it was any decent person would do, that they weren't doing something special, and they were quite ashamed by everything else that was going on around them. And I think that's an incredible. Firstly, it's incredibly successful. If you ever go to New York, go into, say, one of the big camera shops in New York, it won't be open on a Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
The whole industry there, photography industry there, is Jewish, possibly in part because of Leica and what they did to rescue people. But they also suffered a lot of hardship. I think the financial director was put in prison at one stage, and at one stage, the Ernst Leitz's daughter was caught bringing a family through to the Swiss border and was arrested. And I think that's an amazing thing that they did.
Well, it's an amazing story, and this is the first time from hearing that story. And you started off talking about Lenny Kravitz, and you recognized his photography. I'm trying to see understand what was the strategy, that that actually helped the company. Obviously, they made a tremendous impact in the industry in America because they brought all these very talented people over. gave them the camera. They went out and found
It
jobs.
also helped the company because the company had always had this reputation since they founded that it was, it had certain moral principles, and they make, I think, better cameras than anybody else. They have been doing this all along. They got a certain authority to what they do. Like the fact, like Lenny Kravitz is a modern version, but some of the greatest photographers that have ever lived, like Henry Cartier-Bresson, were using Leicas for many years, and they haven't stopped at any stage. They set a tone for the company. They set the culture for the company, and the culture, it's like a lot of other great companies, was about respect for people and constantly innovating, constantly improving.
No, that's hugely important. I think it's super important to know what your sweet spot is and what your target is, because you can't be everything to everybody. And sometimes I remember a story. um, Richard Nixon was in Europe, and he happened to be introduced to the CEO of Rolex, and he asked him a question. So he said something like, "How's the watch business?" And the CEO of Rolex looked at it and he goes, "I wouldn't know.
I don't know. I'm in luxury goods."
Exactly. That's exactly what he said, right? And for him that was obvious, but for outsiders looking in, it's a watch business, not at all, right? And so you have to know that. And I would think in our industry, it's really important to know, like you said, where the loose brick is or what you want to target. And I want to come back to that in a second. But I know that a lot of companies have a shared mission statement, and they will say what their mission statement is and everybody will know it. But I don't hear a lot of companies promoting their strategy. So what are your thoughts in terms of sharing, like, your strategy or a company strategy? Should it be shared should everybody know it? Should shareholders know it? Should the market know it? Should the competitors know it? Or is it something that should be a little bit more tightly held?
Well, one of the possible reasons why some companies don't share their strategy is because they don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge amount of companies that will see something, hear an idea, and follow it, and then follow the next idea. And there's also another problem that many companies have is that they'll have a meeting once a year where all the leadership team get together and they just do brainstorming and whatever and come up with a different set of ideas. And I think this is a major problem. We took a completely different approach over the first few years. We were very lucky in that one of our colleagues had done work as a consultant in advising companies on how to research strategy and how to implement it. So what we did is we allowed them to have 3 months to just talk to our customers, to research, to read all the reports, to look at what the common sense advisory reports say and look at everything else, but mainly to talk to people. And we tried to get to talk to our competitors, to people that were using our competitors' tools. We talked to our customers. We talked to other people within our industry. And we came up with a set of things that of information. One of the things is the strategy framework that we share all the time with people in memoQ. Another is customers told us what is the drivers for us. And we were seeing drivers as the new features that we put in. And they were talking about things like reliability and responsiveness. And that was quite interesting.
No, it's funny because if you get a product team, oftentimes they will think in terms of the next feature, the next function, the next connector, et cetera. And some of that comes from, your customer success managers or because they're like, oh, the customer wants this. And so then there's this rush to just go and get that feature. versus actually, doing a deep dive and understanding what are the real issues there? What are
Exactly.
what are they really trying to achieve? Right. So I'm sorry, cut
Yeah.
you off. Please continue.
No, this is a really good point, because one of the ways we've changed a lot in the last year has been with talking to customers about what they really want. As an example, a freelance translator suggested the idea of having something in the find and replace box that could specify that these terms are not used.
Hmm.
And this was done on our ideas portal where other people could see it. And they said, well, you can do this at the moment through regex. And the original person says, well, you can do it through regex, but I can't. I have no idea what that is.
I want you to make a new feature. I want you to make a new feature just especially for me because I don't understand the other one.
But we talked to him and we talked to various other people. Our product management team spends a lot of time just talking to people. And we also do it so that it's not just the product management team, but it's the product management team and the design team talking with the customer. And what they came to conclusion was that if we could make regex the way of using regular expressions, using a bit of code to specify what happens in something like a search box or whatever, if we could make that simpler, then we've got something that's much more powerful for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we ended up doing. And that's, I think, exactly how we're doing things now. We're not concentrating on, somebody wants a blue button. We don't go and implement a blue button. We spend 6 months talking to them about it. And it may be that we do need a blue button, but it may be we need something entirely different. Because we'll talk to them about it. We'll talk to other people doing similar things. And that's harder work. Yeah. But ultimately, the outcome is much, much better.
Yeah. One of my favorite bosses that I've ever had was the CEO at CLS at the time, Doris Alberser. And what I really liked about working with Doris was that when she would come to Asia, we would go on a 2-week or 3-week basically road trip throughout Asia. And every day we'd be meeting 4, 5, 6 different customers. Plus we would have events. Plus she'd meet with the staff. And it was just continual learning because you could think you're the smartest person in the world in your little cubicle staring at your device. But when you get out and you touch people and you actually get the feedback, you're continually learning what's working, what's not. And then you can, triangulate that information and you can dig deeper. So I think it's super effective. And so what you're saying is part of the way to develop strategy is to really understand what your customers need, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't you tell me a little bit more? I mean, as much as you feel comfortable sharing in terms of what is memoQ's kind of broader strategy. I mean, what came out of all these customer interactions, aside from just saying, hey, we're not going to run and develop a blue button right away. We're going to slow down and check, because that is a strategy, or, that's a framework. Let's analyze it. But what was the outcome in terms of what our strategy is?
One of the main things that came out of it was what you said earlier, that we can't do everything for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
We're much more focused. Like, we clearly see where we can add value to the customer. We try and know that sector as well as we can. We try and make sure that we're working with that, but we don't try to go and do everything for everybody. Like, we probably, if Microsoft or Google has almost fully automated translation system, and they've been working on these for 30 years and have a huge amount of people within their business. And we don't see that as somewhere where, maybe they could use memoQ for something, but it probably wouldn't add huge value to them.
Right.
And in the customers that we're targeting, people in regulated industries and gaming and life science, it's very clear, and it's becoming clearer to the customer how we can add value. And we've got people within the company that are quite focused on seeing what these people need to do to thrive. One of the other elements of our strategy is that we're quite focused on quality. And quality is funny because there's no accepted universal definition of it. The nearest anyone's come to that is the what's in ISO 9001, which is that it's fit for purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that defines quality as something that can do the job the customer wants. We want to go beyond that because we don't want customers to just be able to do their job. We want them to actually thrive. So what our approach to quality is that it's not just about the tool. In the first podcast, you were talking with Shodomir about customer education.
Right.
And we're doing more and more work around trying to make sure that the customer can really learn more and more about how they can benefit from the software. Things like the work we're starting to do in life science, where we've got the life science roundtable and we've got other ideas. It's again helping customers to know how they can do better, not just with our tool, but with their job as translation professionals within an industry like life science. And that's a huge part of quality. The other part of quality is that it's not just on the customer's edge, there's also part where we have to be happy with what we deliver. And, it's very important for us that we do our best, that it's not really acceptable to do have an approach to developing our software or any of the other materials to support that where it's, okay. It has to be something that we feel really happy with and we feel we put a lot of work into. And it's, we believe that it's of high quality. Sorry.
No, I mean, basically what I'm hearing is, it comes back to that quote from Peter Drucker, making a customer and making them happy. We want our customers to thrive. And if they're doing well in their job, then they're going to be happy. And one of the ways to help them thrive is obviously to make a tool that supports their requirements, but also to help them learn how to optimize their use of that tool. So it's that continual education. So it doesn't just stop at, here's your product, see you later. It's that continual engagement. We help them to optimize the use, learn, but also get feedback from them as we go along.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. Like without checking, like another great tool that people have used for probably 100 years or so is Plan, Do, Check, Act.
Yeah.
And, this is something that Edward Deming, I think, he had been working with with an engineer, with a scientist during the Second World War who had this idea, a man called Suhart, I think. And Deming brought that to Japan, where companies like Toyota developed the whole lean and agile methodology around this. And this is something that, if there's one thing you're to do with strategy, it's validating it.
Right.
And there's so many cases where people will have brilliant ideas. They will then go and do their brilliant idea and wonder why it's, they're not as successful as they have. I think everybody's been in that position where they've thought something's brilliant. They maybe had a couple of other people talking with them and they were brainstorming and they got a fabulous idea. But because they'd never checked it, it never improved. And those sort of feedback loops are something that's crucial to a company like ours that wants to continuously grow and to develop and to improve what we're doing. And it's a very, very simple idea that I think was first used about 100 years ago, and it's still probably the best tool we've got.
Right.
Feedback loops are crucial to anybody who's trying to do something new and trying to do something innovative, and also something that involves marketing. The feedback loop is crucial to all that.
Yeah, people talk about agile development, and I look at agile business, agile sales, agile. You have to continually get feedback and learn and evolve continually. Um, it's funny because you were talking about definitions of quality, and you were throwing around some pretty famous names like Deming and and Drucker. One of the craziest things I ever read was, so I'm going to throw around a fancy name, but Aristotle's Neo-Machian Ethics, and he does a whole chapter on quality. And I read that thing like
Mm.
20 times, and I still didn't get it. So, but it was from Aristotle, so it's got to be good. It's got to be deep, man. But I think I should send that to you. It's just here you go, quality defined.
Maybe if you didn't read it in the original Greek, it might help.
Yeah, right. So once you have a strategy, how do you get that strategy to permeate the organization
Yeah,
as part of the culture? How do you do that? Because it's great to have a little mission statement on the wall. It's great to have here's our
yeah.
strategy. But unless people are really kind of internalizing it and using it as a guide point, how do you get them to do that?
Well, we've done a whole range of things. One of the tools we used is that myself, Balaj Kish, or my fellow co-CEO, and Kata, our HR director, spent a lot of time meeting with each of the teams within the company, explaining it to them. And we've had various other things where we're talking about it. As far as I can see, it's something that you can never talk about it too little. You
Hmm.
have to constantly tell people what you're planning. We also have a strategy framework, which is 5 bullet points that list the important parts of our strategy on our intranet. Um, People have issues with strategy and constantly feel that there's a big problem with where they know what they're doing, they know what their team's doing, but they've no idea how that fits in with the strategy, and they're quite suspicious of it. And the reason why they're suspicious of strategy is not because um, they're stupid people. It's the opposite. It's because they're very clever and they've seen this before, and they've seen how difficult it is for a company to come up with a clear plan, stick with it, modify it as needed to make them more successful, but have a clear idea where they want to go and have a clear way of getting there. And that's not an easy thing to do. This is something that we're trying to do at the moment. I think we're being reasonably successful with this, but it's a legitimate thing for somebody working in memoQ to feel that they don't fully get it and to question it. And what we're trying to do is to make it so that it's easier to ask the questions, so that we can then we can then answer it and then hopefully have it so that that they've got a clear idea of how we're going to make progress. I think people are pretty clear that we're aiming for certain sectors such as regulated industries, life
Hmm.
sciences, gaming, translators, and that's a huge part of the strategy, because then we have, for example, the product management team has got what they call swim lanes that fit more or less within those areas. And we can see how almost every part of the company aligns over this.
Yeah. What I've seen, and again, I'm relatively new to memoQ, is that there is a lot of communication going on. It doesn't feel like a very hierarchical organization. It feels to me quite flat. And there's a continual amount of information sharing. We have our monthly meetings, for example, where a lot of information is shared that isn't always shared in other organizations that I've been involved with. There's um, there's there's a continual kind of dialogue in terms of tying this information to our strategy, or tying upcoming activities or targets to our ultimate strategy. We also have, I participated in the leadership team meeting, which involved a large number of people in the company, but it was all kind of to tie together, what direction are we going in and why are we going in that direction? So, only having been in the company, uh, for a relatively short time,
Yeah.
I think I'm pretty aware of what our strategy is. And again, I think that's becomes because you and Balaj and the other leaders in the company are continually kind of sharing it, but also tying it into what we're doing. And it's not,
Yeah.
again, you can put a mission statement on a wall, but unless you tie that into specific activities or targets, it doesn't always connect with people. So I think
Yeah.
you've done a really good job with that.
Thank you. And it's not just me, but I think the company is quite receptive to this because it's not always been the case that the strategy has been talked about so much. If anything, was one of the issues that we had to fix when we became co-CEOs, and I think that's happened. I think we're in reasonable shape with this, but it definitely is something that you have to keep talking about. And if I we talked about business literature, if you read books like John Doerr's book about OKRs, there are quite a few times in that book where he's talking to some executive from a very well-known company like Google or Intuit and whoever, and they're talking about that you have to keep saying it. You have to,
Yeah.
you can't. Um, if you think you've talked about strategy too much, you're probably mistaken.
Right.
And if somebody's tired of hearing, one of we may have got to a stage. Like one of the things we want to do is to build on the conversation, so that people are telling us how they see their work fitting in with the company strategy in the next series of meetings we're going to do around strategy.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's a two-way dialogue then. If we are actually saying, "Hey, this is how my job, what I'm doing aligns with our strategy." It's not you telling me. I'm connecting the dots on that. Pretty important. You mentioned a book, and you mentioned a couple famous authors. For imagine, you're the CEO or an executive in a small, medium-sized LSP, and you're like, you know what? That we definitely need a strategy, and we've been just kind of business as usual for the last few years. I want to learn more about this. What are some other resources that you'd recommend?
Uh, I think there's a lot of information out there. I would recommend reading this book, The Practice of Management. Like part of it may feel partly dated because he always uses he rather than anything else in the book, but that's just because it was written in the 1950s. But it's an unusual book, and that one of the issues he's talking about is the people being worried about automation coming in and taking their jobs and whatever, which is exactly the sort of thing that people are talking about now with
Yeah.
artificial intelligence and different sorts of automation. And it's amazing to think that it's been it's been going on so long. One of the companies to study in all this, I think, is Toyota, because what they've done over, like, Toyota's company is almost 100 years old, and it was firstly a company that built looms um, for making cloth. And one of the things they found is that if they could find a way to automate these looms so that when a thread broke in the cloth, it would automatically stop, then they could have one person looking after many more looms.
Hmm.
And this idea of stopping things, once there's a problem, stop it and fix it, is something that they've been doing in their automobile factories all over the world for many, many years. And they've brought in a lot of other really clever ideas based on, Kanban, for example, is used by our development team. And this is something that came from the Toyota the Toyota automobile company. The ideas that they have come up with have been quite brilliant. There's an awful lot of courses for people on LinkedIn, on Udemy, and there's a huge amount of material available there. One of the interesting things within our industry is there's many people that do actually know something about strategy and whatever. Like one of our customers, Richard Brooks of K International, has been talking about probably the same presentation for the last 10 years with different slides. But his presentation is basically an introduction to what Peter Drucker says in that. It's well worth looking at what he said. There's a huge amount of information out there. I don't think that's the easiest thing. And talk to people within the industry. If you if you're telling people that you're a genius and you've got all the answers, nobody will feel the need to talk to you and figure out how they can help you. But if you're saying, look, here's my set of problems, how do I do this? How do I do that? At various industry events like ELIA and Gala and ALC and so on, there'll be people there that will tell you the answers.
That's really important. Again, it comes back down to asking questions and talking to a lot of people. I want to kind of jump a little bit sideways here, because when I look at the local industry, I haven't been in as long as you, but I've been long enough to see a lot of different acquisitions, and sometimes I feel like there are acquisitions for the sake of just growing, versus a smart acquisition. Maybe could you just talk a little bit about your thoughts on M&A strategy, effective and not?
Yeah, it's difficult to know. I see some examples where there's been a big announcement and somebody has put a lot of money into a company and it hasn't changed it. It's something, one of the problems with, if, for example, somebody lends you $5 million or whatever, is they'll want to say in how you do things. And often they will not know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be a difficulty there. There's been a lot of, like our biggest competitor is SDL, and they were acquired by RWS. And I have no idea how that's working out, and I don't want to comment on it. But some of the people that we used to compete with at SDL were some of the best people in our industry, and we're not competing with them anymore because since the acquisition, they've moved on to other jobs. So from our perspective, it's a good thing. But
well, I mean, because what you're saying is you're going to acquire this company. They have all this industry expertise. That's a huge asset, especially in the competitive landscape of software development in the world today, where your development team, your business team is probably your most valuable asset aside in it, talk about brand, etc. And then if you just lose all those people, what's the upside there?
And particularly if you lose if you lose the people, because there's been, you're striving to impress, people that run equity funds.
We've cut costs. We've cut costs. So look how great your investment looks now. Yeah. But yeah, I get you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think at the moment, the translation technology sector is very competitive. Like, MemSource has been bought by Carlyle, XTM has been bought by K1, SDL has been bought by RWS. We're the sole independent bootstrapped company that's been a big player. But for us, there's a lot of good things about this, because there's no point competing with companies that are, don't feel that they're good. You want to compete with the best and you want to win. It would not help us at all if we were to, if our competitors were didn't know what they were doing or whatever. We want to really win against them, and we want to win against the best companies out there. Give you an example of how this happened. You've presumably heard of Bailey's Irish Cream.
Oh, yes.
They...
In fact, that's my mother-in-law's favorite gift when I show up, is because you fly duty free and all that, and it's like Bailey's, and she's like, never had it before, and was like, oh my god, so now I gotta, every time I go, another bottle.
Well, at one stage, they discovered that there was a lot of imitation Irish creams out there. And they started tasting them and then instantly thought, oh, we're going to trash these people. It's going to be no problem. And then they thought about it further and they realized they had a problem. Because what happens if your mother tastes,
the competitor?
Yeah, a competitor, and it was awful.
Yeah.
She will never try another Irish cream at all. So what they did is they gave the recipe to their competitors.
Well, that's funny. They're like, come on, man! If you're going to make Irish cream, you make it the right way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a company coming in.
Same problem.
It's like a company coming in selling like bogus champagne, and they just drive the whole name down, right? So do it the right way. Yeah, go ahead.
But it's also a problem in our sector. Like if somebody wants a translation management system, and they buy one that, and they think that it's pretty standard. If it doesn't match what they need, they're going to have it's not that easy to replace them. And if it's really awful, then they'll do something else next time. They may just send all their translation to a translation company and get it done that way, or try some other solution.
Try to develop something on their own,
we're very focused on our quality, but we have to be in a sector where all the competitors have some sort of basic level of quality. And I think, in fairness to them, that's there. I think we're much better than them, but I think that they're, they're people that they're worthy competitors.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you saying, and my original question was about acquisition and so on. That is, there are sometimes acquisitions for the sake of just trying to enhance the financial bottom line by taking over a business, capturing the revenues, and then cutting costs, which doesn't seem super smart if you're losing some really, really smart people. And then there are companies that take investment, and but by taking investment, they're losing control of their organization. At the same time, ultimately, what you're saying, it's actually good to have competitors who are competitive, because if they were out there giving everybody a bad experience of what a TMS is, that would make it harder for us, because people would be like, yeah, I tried it, it doesn't work. But so exactly. You want to be in kind of a healthy industry that people respect, and that's where we're at.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's exactly what I think is quite important.
Well, hey, Peter, I've really enjoyed this, and I love taking notes. I've got 2 books on my list here that I'm gonna read. Any parting thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, it was a hugely enjoyable conversation. Thank you very much. If any of your listeners want to contact me, that they can do so with just peter.reynolds@memoQ.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions that they may have. So thank you again, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You take care. Bye.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.